current mattress is only 2 months old at this point. And when I lie down at night, it takes hardly any time at all for me to fall asleep. The foam feels like it just wraps itself around me until I'm in this perfectly formed space. In recent years, I've gotten over my insomnia and I've been able to fall asleep quickly, but with a new mattress, there are nights that I hardly even remember lying down before I drift off. But that was not the case to begin with. The mattress we previously had was one that my wife and I purchased about 7 or 8 years before. It was, when we bought it, the most comfortable mattress that I had ever slept on. A soft little hideaway to rest in the night. But over time, something strange began to happen, and I noticed certain places where the mattress had an indentation. The indentation was comfortable for the most part, and in fact, it was perfect in some ways because I made it. One of the things the indentation did, however, was it molded too well to my body, making it too easy for me to think I was comfortable in that position, but the position wasn't necessarily one that was good for my body. So, when we went to other places, I would sleep well, but sometimes I would wake up, notice that I had a crick in my neck or my back felt kind of funny. I would have this sore ache. Eventually, though, I knew I would be at home, so I didn't worry too much about it. Now, entropy, or the second law of thermodynamics, tells us all things fall apart. And the mattress was no exception. It did not exactly fall apart, but it did get to the place that we decided we needed a new mattress. So we ordered a new mattress and a bed frame, and we retired the other one to a guest room. The new mattress was made of multi-layered foam. And when it finally took shape after having been compressed for packing, it was absolutely, completely, totally uncomfortable. For the first week that I slept on this mattress, I woke every day with a sore place in my lower back, and I had a crick in my neck, this pain right here, right at the back of my neck. And I thought maybe it was my pillows. And so I messed with them, and I got some new pillows and put them on. And then I thought maybe I picked something up wrong at the office or what have you. And then I kept trying to sort it out, and I couldn't figure it out. And I think finally my wife mentioned something, and she said to me, "You're used to the old one." Apparently my body had contoured its shape when I was sleeping to the old mattress and was still trying to figure out how to sleep on this new mattress. In truth, I think what really happened was I was finally sleeping on a mattress that had the right kind of support, and it was supporting all of those places that had been unsupported before, and it made them hurt because now they actually had support. It took me about a week or so, but I finally got used to sleeping on it, and now when I lay down at night, I just fall asleep and I'm usually gone. Liberation theology, what we're going to talk about this morning, this lens that we're going to look at among all of these other lenses that we've looked at, was the new mattress that was born out of the social change at the end of the 60s. And in the late 60s and early 70s, the situations in America and in Central America, Latin America, that were social, political, and economic were situations in many cases of oppression and injustice. And these gave birth to the development of various theological perspectives, both in North and South America. At this particular time and place, there was a willing audience for this in the African American, the Latin American, and the feminist communities. And what they were doing was they were all reacting to this change, the unrest in their time. This is where liberation theology was born. Now, liberation theology is a theology of and for those who have been oppressed and downtrodden. It's a perspective on God and the gospel born from the point of view of the marginalized. It's a way of interpreting the Bible from political, economic, and social circumstances. The theologies define the issues of racism, sexism, and male-dominated society, poverty and economic oppression, all of these things as the primary social sins born out of the political and social systems that were held in control by a dominant few. Liberation theology has been a political engagement, and through its history, activism and movements of resistance, oppression to dominance, and disempowerment and violence practiced by marginalized groups who have been invaded, conquered, colonized, dispersed, or displaced and subordinated, have been a part of this. These expressions of theology focus on social change that gives voice to the gospel for those who can't speak for themselves because of their situation. Many liberation theologians feel that God has a special preference for the oppressed and believe that the marginalized have a special insight into God's will for any given situation. Therefore, salvation is historical and social. It's not individual. It's something that happens within a community experience. It's kind of like the Exodus in the Old Testament. It's something that the entire community uses as a lens and experience to see God through. In his classic work, A Black Theology of Liberation, James Cone wrote, "Theology is always done for particular times and places and addressed to a specific audience." Now, this is the case for liberation theology. This is the case that liberation theology was a school of thought that practiced theology in a time and a place and a circumstance. And that specific circumstance was in those communities. Now, for us that live outside of those communities, it's hard for us to see in. It's hard for us to be able to look at that and really understand where they're coming from, because the language they use, the things that they have to say, the way that they have to say it, doesn't make sense to us. We don't connect to it because it's not our language. It would be like me standing up here and having doing the sermon in German. You might catch a word or two there. You might sprechen Sie a little bit, but you won't sprechen Sie much unless you know German. And so this perspective comes to a particular people in a particular time in a particular place. Now, liberation theologians reject universal theology or a way of interpreting God. These theologians such as James Cone and Rosemary Reuter and Gustavo Gutierrez all advocate that theology calls for a theological response, but it also calls for us to have an active participation in society and the liberation of the oppressed. It leads to social activism, to political activism, and in some cases, particularly in Latin America, a revolutionary engagement. Some of this we find in the United Methodist Church now. Some of it sometimes in good ways and sometimes in bad ways. This happens in any denomination. There are always positive and negative expressions of things. There's some positive expressions in the United Methodist Church in terms of things like UMCOR, which is the United Methodist Committee on Relief, which gives thousands of dollars worth of supplies to people who have experienced floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, all of that. There are organizations within the Methodist Church that reach out to the homeless. These are positive aspects of social activism, and these are things that we need to consider because these are part of the gospel. But some of them have led to a more revolutionary engagement. They've led to people being involved, especially in Latin America, in revolutions to overthrow governments. They've led to, in some cases, misunderstandings between people groups. And a lot of it has to do with the language that is used. And it's hard language to hear sometimes. For those that take the time to engage it, liberation theology is uncomfortable. And I had an uncomfortable time with some of it this week. But like the backache that lets you know you're sleeping in an awkward position or you need a new mattress, the discomfort exists to let you know that something isn't quite right. While we often ignore pain thinking it'll go away, or we take medication to dull the sharpness of it, the pain should cause us to ask, why am I uncomfortable? Rather than, how do I get rid of this? Even in the potential discomfort of reading this type of theology, there's something to be learned about how we can live out the gospel, the simplicity of loving God and loving neighbor. There's also something we can learn about the political and social systems that drive our culture and have a better perspective on who Big Brother is and what Big Brother's really up to. How we as the church need to respond to that. So we're going to try to apply some of this. And we're going to use this story with Jesus and Nicodemus. Now, as we read this story, there are features that if we view them through a liberation theology lens, we see the story a little bit differently than most of us have read it in the past. What we find is Nicodemus, a man of station and power, meeting Jesus in the middle of the night. Now, I got a question. Why does Nicodemus want to meet Jesus in the middle of the night? I mean, wouldn't it be better to make an appointment during daylight hours? Well, Nicodemus is a person that represents a group of people that make up the system of power and privilege among the Jewish people. Pharisees were the teachers of the religious and cultural law. They were a very strict group of people whose adherence to certain tradition and teaching was so rigid and detailed that it seemed almost impossible for anyone to live up to their expectations. As the ones who set and enforced these social and religious norms, they were part of a structure that held the authority over the lives of the Jews, especially those within the regions outside of Jerusalem, where the temple was not a part of their daily activity. That said, to openly come to Jesus and acknowledge him as a teacher or a rabbi in broad daylight would be to diminish some of his own privilege and his own power and give legitimacy to Jesus. So Nicodemus the Pharisee hides his curiosity for the community, and he comes to Jesus at night. Now he begins a conversation by engaging Jesus as an equal or possibly even a superior. And he says to Jesus, Rabbi. Now rabbi is a term that denotes a teacher of the law and therefore someone in authority. Now there are people that might argue that this is done in a genuine way. A way to let Jesus know that Nicodemus is truly interested in his ministry and his message and that he's taking this seriously. There are some that would also look at it and say this was sarcasm, done with the intention of buttering Jesus up. We can't say for certain whether it was sarcasm, because when you write sarcasm, sarcasm is not obvious. I mean, really, you got to hear it to understand it. There's no tone of voice necessarily here in the Greek. So when Nicodemus is speaking to Jesus, he says we, meaning himself and others who may be curious among the Pharisees. We know that you're a teacher who's come from God, and no one could do these miraculous signs and things that you do unless God is with him. The statement is a probing statement. He's trying to get Jesus to react and respond. He's thinking Jesus is either going to say, well, yeah, I know. Yeah, definitely God is with me. Of course God is with me. And then Jesus becomes another in a long line of charlatans. Or he's hoping to see Jesus practice some false modesty maybe. Well, I'm just a humble servant. The kind of false modesty that Pharisees quite often practiced. Jesus does neither of these things. Jesus sees the man, recognizes that he's either a misguided, misunderstanding cleric or a manipulative politician who's looking for information. Either way, Jesus seeks to do what Jesus was sent to do. To liberate Nicodemus from this system, from this circumstance. It's here the discussion on being born again or born anew in order for us to see or understand God's kingdom begins. Jesus says we need both physical and spiritual birth to be whole. And Nicodemus answers him the deep theological question. Huh? Now, throughout this passage, A liberation theologian might find a treasure trove of things to mine, and we could continue on to this, but I think in the interest of time, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the major theme of these verses, and that is liberation through Jesus. Remember, liberation is not just in a spiritual realm, but it's in the physical world as well. For the Jews that read this, for those that were under Roman oppression reading this gospel, this was a powerful message. And if viewed through the liberation lens, it was a message that said more than just our spirits can be freed in Jesus, but we can be free from Rome in Jesus as well. And so the writer of John expounds on the Son of Man being lifted up like the snake in the wilderness of the Old Testament, a sign of healing and restoration that has long been a part of Jewish culture. The writer then points to the crucifixion, and he says this: God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him won't perish but have eternal life. God didn't send his Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him isn't judged. Whoever doesn't believe in him is already judged, because they don't believe in the name of God's only Son. And so a liberation theologian, a person, would find their healing and restoration, their true freedom, not only in the spiritual freedom that's found in believing in Jesus, but in understanding that believing in means something beyond intellectual agreement. It's more than just saying, yep, Jesus is Lord. It means that those who are true believers and really believe that Jesus is Lord go from feeling to fact, looking to bring a social and a political state of freedom and restoration to the world and the world systems around them in this life as part of living out a physical kingdom of God on earth. It would be read as an invitation, a calling, an imperative to see that everyone truly means everyone, and that all have a seat at the table of grace. All will be included in the body of Christ. All will serve in whatever capacity they've been called to. No one would be looked down on or denied a chance to serve based on things like race, gender, sexuality, social standing, economic standing. All means all. If it does not mean all, it is not right and will not be right until all means all. Now, honestly, this is challenging if you're not a part of one of these communities. For me, reading this week and studying this perspective this week, I had a very difficult time. I struggled with it. I read James Cone's book, A Black Liberation of Theology. And there was a lot in it that was hard to listen to, because he's writing from a place of pain, as do most people who write liberation theology. They're writing from a place of hurt. They're writing from a place of having been denied and marginalized. And they're writing out of that pain. People who write out of pain lash out. I mean, think about it. Somebody hurts you. What's your instinct? Hurt them back. So in some ways, they're trying to say there's something beyond the theology that's been there all this time. It's beyond the norm of theology. And there's another way to look at it. In some ways, they're saying we should just overthrow the system. Wreck it all, start it over. But they do have some questions that are worth asking. Even if you disagree with those ideas, they have some questions, I think, that are worth asking, and that I was able to glean from this and in a personal way be able to look at this and say there's value and validity to what they're saying. We have to ask ourselves if the gospel is truly for everyone. And if it's not, why hasn't everyone been made to feel welcome? To be made to feel like it's for them? Why do we only recognize those who are most like us as acceptable? Why are we afraid of those who are simply not part of our tribe? Better question may be, why, before they were even accepted or even knew they wanted what he had to offer, did Jesus go to those on the margins? The lame, the blind, the unacceptable, the socially cast out. Why did he go to them first? And even if we don't go to them first, why don't we go to them as well? These are hard questions. These are hard things that are being asked of us by these theologians and by this way of looking at it. But I believe that there is something to understanding the Bible from a place of liberation. Do we not all want to be free? Do we not all want to experience life that is good? Do we not all want to experience life abundant, as Jesus said? I believe we do. And I believe when I say we all want to experience that, I believe that it cuts across every social, political barrier. We all want to experience that. We might all define it differently, but we all want to experience it. So how do we help those who aren't experiencing it come to a place to where they can? It's a tough question, but I think it's a question that we have to ask. And I think for ourselves and our community, it's a question we have to answer.